Okay, at this time, it's my privilege to introduce my extension colleague and my friend for many years. I've known Ron for most of his career in one fashion or another, but it's actually only been the last few years that we've really been able to work closely together. Dr. Ron Gill is a professor of extension, livestock, and a beef cattle specialist for Texas A&M Agrilife Extension. He also serves as Associate Department Head and Program Leader for Extension within A&M's Department of Animal Science. He provides leadership for extension programming related to animal well-being, stockmanship, and low-stress livestock handling, and he assists in providing leadership to statewide efforts in beef safety and quality assurance programming. He is also president of Effective Stockmanship LLC, providing training and consultation related to livestock handling and facility design in all phases of the beef cattle industry. He was the co-founder of and assists with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association Stockmanship and Stewardship Program, conducting trainings across North America. In addition, he owns and manages Gill Cattle Company, a commercial cow-calf and stocker cattle operation near Decatur, Texas. Ladies and gentlemen, he was one of the stars in 2019, and we are so glad at our beef conference with Dr. Temple Grandin. And Ron, we're so thrilled to have you back. Thanks for what you do. Help me recognize Dr. Ron Gill. Thanks, appreciate you.
Well, I've been sitting back here in the same table for the last couple of days, and everybody's always been saying, boy, I hate to follow that presentation. You ought to have this one. I just assume we dismiss for the day, to be honest with you, because all I'm going to do is make you mad. We have a really good inspirational speaker, and I'm going to work on Andy and his program planning process. Because once again, we're going to have some things to discuss here that won't be as pleasant as what we've heard before. Been a great conference, and there's been a lot of mention about sustainability and proper rangeland management and good cattle management, right? And so how many in this room can really understand why people keep attacking beef? Anybody in here really understand that? Didn't raise my hand either, did I? But we're going to talk about some reasons that they do and why this whole effort is out there, okay? Because it is not, it's not random by any stretch of the imagination. So we kind of have to know what we're fighting before we can know how to fight it, okay? And so that's something that we do have a challenge with in this industry, because there's not very many of us, and how do we fight this at a larger level? But why are we even talking about all this? There was a publication back in early 2006, I think, called Livestock's Long Shadow. Has anybody ever seen or heard of that paper? It's really good reading if you don't want to go to sleep for a while, okay? It's one of those that, and I'm just going to go through a lot of what's in there because it kind of sets the stage for where we're at in this discussion, okay? The Green New Deal, of course, got a lot of attention. But the Green New Deal actually came to fruition because of that Livestock's Long Shadow. They took information from there, start developing policy. Everybody's, why in the world we develop policy about cows that belch? Okay, so why do we do that? Anybody get aggravated with meatless Mondays, and now we have meatless months, and Epicure, there's some online recipe company just said they were no longer going to put beef in their recipes because they cared about the planet. Okay, so Like I told y'all looking at me like I'm the one that scheduled this. It's him. Don't be looking at me like y'all are right now. Well, there's some dead-looking faces looking this way. And there's a whole lot of other things involved in this process, but it really comes down to there is a faction of the world that does not understand nature, cycles, carbon cycles, all that kind of stuff, and where we actually play a positive role in that. But we also have some issues to deal with, and so we have to talk about that. So if you want to look up Livestock's Long Shadow, you can do that online, pull up a PDF and read 15 pages of it. I'm going to go through some of the stuff in this document because it sets the stage for what we're really dealing with. It wants to document the various significant impacts of the world's livestock sector on the environment. It's deliberate. It's turned Livestock's Long Shadow so we can help raise attention to both the technical and general public to the very substantial contribution of animal agriculture to climate change, air pollution, land and soil degradation, and the reduction of biodiversity. That's their first statement. So you think this will be an unbiased report? No, their intent was to do what they did and really cast a long shadow on beef production. It gets worse. It's not done simply to blame us for all that's wrong, but it has some other motives as well, okay? The detailed assessment of these various environmental impacts of this sector is therefore associated with the outline of technical and policy-related actions to address these impacts. Are we there? How many policy things are being talked about right now to address what we're talking about here? Whether they're doing it off fact or not, we're at that point, okay? And it's to do this not only at the U.S. level, but in a global manner so that we can change that. And if we're going to increase meat production to meet the increasing world population, livestock will have even a greater environmental impact. So they want us to really curb that so we don't have an environmental impact, but we still need to feed people. We start seeing some contradictory things in their thought process, at least to me. As we go through this, I'm going to bring up some other points they made in that report because we need to understand what they're using as the basis for their beliefs. And this is a belief system, by the way. It's not anything about facts or well, there's some facts involved, there's numbers involved, but it's developed a whole new belief system within people. There are climate fanatics, all right, because of what some of this has led to, and it has scared the bejesus out of a lot of folks. Poor little Greta. Bless her heart, she's scared to death the world's going to end because of global warming, right? And so we have to really understand what they're doing. But this is the things that they point out in this report that are so damning to our industry, and one we really have to work on. But I also want you to think about some of the things we've talked about here today and yesterday. Do we have a role in land degradation? Y'all remember seeing Frank Price's graph on carrying capacity? Is it in a positive mode or declining mode? Declined, right? Quite a bit. Who's in charge of that? If we have dominion over God's creatures and all that He's put here, should we not be doing a better job than that? I'm not going to get preachy, trust me. But there are some valid things that they're bringing up here that we have to admit are valid and have a real plan to help fix it. Now, is it as bad here as in other parts of the world? Probably not, but we got to take care of our own camp. Okay? An expansion of livestock is a key factor in deforestation. Have we cleared forest in the United States to run cattle? Y'all know we have more forest land in the United States right now than ever in the history of the United States. But this is the perception that we're clearing forest to run cattle. Actually, that's not the case. We're more money to be made in forest land, so if you can grow trees, plant trees, folks. One reason there's a timber shortage right now, they're paying forest company or wood companies, lumber companies, to leave it in the forest, and they're getting carbon credits for not cutting trees. Okay? So we're going to have bigger timber later, but right now we're getting short. There's a whole bunch of things going in here. 20% of the world's pasture and rangelands, or 73% of those are in dry areas. We can testify to that, can't we? We've got a large part of that. So overgrazing can be a problem. Joe, I think you said you had a fellow there that said he helped dig those ditches. And so if that's the case, we had a role in land degradation, erosion, water control, water quality, all those things we've had a role in. So we can't say that this is all just nonsense, because there is some validity to what they're talking about. And we have a responsibility to change that. Now, atmosphere and climate. This is getting to be a biggest one that they're really after us on right now. But with rising temperatures, rising sea levels, melting ice caps, glaciers, shifting ocean currents, weather patterns, climate change, the most serious challenge facing the human race. Pretty bold statement, isn't it? But that is the belief system that now exists in a large portion of the policymakers in the world. Okay? Now, with that, the livestock sector is a major player responsible for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions measured by CO2 equivalent. And I have to put that in there because we emit more methane than we do carbon dioxide. But they convert all that to CO2 equivalent. And it says it's a higher share than transportation. Now, how many of y'all think our cows belch more methane than the transportation industry creates? But this is the number everybody's going off of in developing policy. This does not represent the U.S. And that's where I'm going to get to before this is globally, but where do we fit in the U.S.? Because we are much more efficient at some of this than other parts of the world. And there's reasons why. Water, this is the other one they beat us up on quite a bit. And so water is one, we use a lot of water. Is the aquifer going down? What are we doing with that water? We're growing crops primarily for what? Livestock, okay? So that counts against us. We're pulling water, we're using water, all that gets accounted for in this lifetime assessment kind of mentality they have. If you read that, we are pretty bad on water. You know, read that last major source of pollution are from animal waste, antibiotics, hormones, chemicals, tanneries, fertilizers, pesticides, and sediments from eroded pastures. Do we really know how much we're contributing to those? Anybody doing any studies to look at that? I don't know if y'all know a Copano Bay project down in South Texas in the Corpus Bay. They were blaming animal agriculture on that, degradation of that bay ecosystem. And so they got to really doing the profiling, and a lot of it was actually horse manure, not cattle, but they were dumping shavings in the creeks. And then the wildlife was the second largest polluter. Cows were not in there. What about the Bosque River in Waco? Blamed all the dairies, right? Started doing testing on it. Very little of the bacterial load was actually coming from dairies. It was more wildlife and human. Once again, we better document what we're causing and what we're not causing so we can fight some of this, and it's not been a priority for this industry to do so. But the dairy industry in the Bosque River Basin had to, but that's also why a lot of those guys left there and are up here, okay? So there's reasons we're moving, and one of it is to control runoff a little better and not have those issues. The whole water deal is a big issue, but they also throw in pesticide use, antibiotics, everything else that might get in the water. And they keep coming back to the deforestation issue and the problems it have. That's primarily a South American issue that they're dealing with there. Biodiversity. Frank talked a lot about biodiversity in his presentation. About by creating a better grazing environment, we create a more diverse ecosystem. And therefore, we have more wildlife and biodiversity. Better soil moisture, more biodiversity. So the better we are at range management, the better we are at fighting this perception that we're degrading ecosystems. But that is something that we really have to think about. We've displaced a lot of wildlife with cattle. All the bison nearly at one time, right, were displaced. What about whitetail deer? No. Well, I think Frank said something about you can shoot them all and they'd be back tomorrow kind of deal, right? Why do we have a big increase in wildlife production, whitetail deer in particular? What caused that? Exactly. Joe's old enough to remember why we nearly annihilated the wildlife population, particularly whitetail deer, because of screwworms. So the cattle industry actually invented the technique to get rid of the screwworm that saved the wildlife populations. We don't talk about that. We should. What about water sources? You just got cattle a half mile from water sources. How far do wildlife have to go for water sources? Ranchers are the predominant maintainers of the wildlife populations. Can you imagine what this country would look like if we weren't damming up creeks and having water wells and water troughs? What would the wildlife population look like? It would be gone. The drought would have taken them out. Okay? So we need to claim some credit where credit is due. But if we don't know why they're after us and we don't think through what benefits we've been to wildlife, we just take the hit and keep going. Some of this is redundant. I'm going to skip through that just in the interest of time. That's just out of the deal. And then they have this executive summary. And it aims to assess the full impact of the livestock sector on environmental problems, along with potential technical and policy approaches to mitigating that. The other issue they're concerned about is increasing need for feed production. Now, one thing that allows us to have less methane production in the United States than other countries is because of the way we feed cattle. By feeding grain, we actually decrease methane production. By feeding ionophores like Bovatec and Rumensin, we reduce methane. That's why cattle are more efficient. They don't excrete methane. They produce something else that's usable by the animal. So our technologies have allowed us to reduce methane production in the U.S. beef cattle herd. We're just the top 2 or 3 most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems. Y'all didn't know y'all were just destroying the world, did you? All right. It's at a massive scale, and potential contribution to the solution is equally large. Now remember that statement, because I'm going to challenge that a little bit. It needs to be addressed with urgency, and that's what's happening right now. People trying to get a little urgency in this. Major reduction in impact can be achieved at a reasonable cost. I don't know what their cost structure looks like, but that's what they're saying. Then it gets into a little bit about, it's not really that important globally, but some people the only currency they have is livestock in the world. In a lot of the African countries, the more livestock you have, the more wealthy you are. So their incentive is not to have good rangeland management, it's to have more cattle, and therefore we degrade more pasture land. So those are all things you have to fight from an economic side as well as an environmental side to get that done. How many of y'all read down to the last bullet there? They're a major contributor to obesity, but are also a potential remedy for malnutrition. One, the obesity deal's wrong, and 2, we are a great source of protein to a malnourished world. But we can't get past that obesity thing that's out there. Because of fat, people think that converts into fat in people. That's not how that works. But we've done a poor job of explaining that. So you're going to hear this term as we go through here, so I just put the definition up. It's environmental pollution originating in human activity. Do y'all know a cow is considered human activity that emits greenhouse gases? Not that it's a natural thing that happens. I guess bison would be considered normal, I don't know. But anyway, it's thrown under the same category as a car, as a coal plant. So that's something that we really probably ought to work on, is how that's classified. How can a naturally occurring organism be considered a human activity? But because we raise it for food, it's considered a human activity. All right. We already talked about how we're going to kill the human race off because of livestock. That 18% keeps coming up in every discussion. So this is what it looks like in the United States. About 3% in the atmosphere is fluorinated gases, 6% nitrous oxide, 10% methane, carbon dioxide, about 82% of greenhouse gases. Okay? Now where does that come from? Remember that statement that we were more detrimental than all of transportation in that big report? Look what transportation is in this when you actually do the numbers. 28% of all of that comes from transportation, 28% from electric, 22% from industry, only 9% from agriculture, and only 4% of that is livestock. Okay? So we've got this 18 number thrown up there all the time, and we contribute somewhere between 2 and 4% of actual greenhouse gases. That's just, and why is methane, we keep harping on methane. Methane has the potential to trap more heat than carbon dioxide does. So that's why it's associated with more global warming issues. Nitrous oxide is actually more potent, and then fluorinated gases are more potent than that in holding heat in the atmosphere. The thing they don't tell you is that methane breaks down over time. So methane does not accumulate in the atmosphere. It breaks down over about a 12-year period, and then it goes back into carbon dioxide, goes back into the plants, goes back into the cattle, the cycle. Ever heard the carbon cycle? Cattle are a normal part of the carbon cycle. And that's why plant communities need grazing ruminants to stay healthy. That story doesn't get told near enough. And there's some really good work going on right now trying to dispel this myth, and a lot of universities are doing that. I'm actually trying to hire somebody within our group to kind of take this effort on, because I'm a poor substitute for a good person in this field. But I shared a few things on social media, and then Andy sucked me into doing this here. So I'm going to be careful what I do on social media, and I thought it was other things that get you in trouble. But methane impact in the U.S. is much different than what it is on a global basis. You know, and I thought, well, 2% of a whole lot of greenhouse gases is a lot. But I'm going to show you that we still don't contribute that much to greenhouse gases. But this is one that we really look at, and like I said, the livestock, about 2% in this study came from livestock, at least beef cattle. All right, here about 9%, that's from all of the livestock sector, and that includes the crops and everything else that goes with it. The reason, like I said, that this potential to hold heat is a concern. We're going to get past all that, and this kind of goes into how it's more impactful and holds more heat in the atmosphere. We're going to spend time on that. This is the statement on policy. We have such a deep and wide-ranging environmental impact that should rank as one of the leading focuses of environmental policy. And we are at that point, right? Every politician on one side of the aisle is talking about this as being a pillar of their political agenda, to save the world by cutting out greenhouse gases from livestock. Now, I'm going to pose this question. If we got rid of all meat consumption in the United States, what would happen to methane gas production? You'd probably go up. Because what's keeping it from going up right now? We're eating cows. If we don't eat them, what's going to happen? Look at the wild horse populations in the West. It's become a bigger environmental issue because we stopped eating them and using them for food. So we got to start telling that story. This is all part of that cycle and getting things done right. So we can't just eliminate meat consumption and change environmental impact. So to make this work, we'd have to get rid of all ruminant animals in the ecosystem. I think that's a pretty big blow to biodiversity. So there's just not a lot of real thought process going into some of these assumptions and things that are being made on if we do this, we're going to have this effect. There is no simple fix to any of this. We'll get through that too. The other part of this, because, and they make this statement in here, I may have skipped over that slide, but this is affects everybody, and so we can't rely on human interaction and private responses to do this because of economic considerations. Why do we overstock sometimes? If we've got the ability to make a little more money, do we mine a resource a little bit? And I'm going to tell you right now, folks, there's no problem with mining a resource for a little bit. The problem is if we don't let it recover. Remember what Frank was talking about? His whole deal was recovery. We can hammer a piece of property for a little while, but we got to let it recover. That's the problem. We don't ever let it recover when we go through these periods. So that's critical in understanding everything we've talked about the last 2 days all fits into what we're talking about here. Building all this so we have a very sustainable system. This is the fear, right? As we change the climate, it shifts to warmer. Is the climate really getting that much warmer? You know, according to Frank, we're actually getting a little more rainfall. But what was also in that graph that Frank showed? A little more volatility in the rainfall patterns, right? Averages were going up. So that's one of the issues that people are concerned about. I don't know if this causes it or not, but that's one of the issues that we have related to that. So are we going to have more hot weather, more extreme weather? You know, they don't call it global warming anymore. It's climate change. So it doesn't matter whether it goes up or down. The fact is they can claim that the environment is being impacted by these factors because it's changing it. Has the world ever been static? No, never. All right, but here's one reason all the concern is happening, okay? Atmospheric concentration of CO2 is increasing quite a bit. All right? No doubt about it. And when you put that in an over time kind of graph and change that scale, it looks a little more ominous, doesn't it? For 800,000 years through carbon dating, these are the carbon cycles they've picked up for 800,000 years. Starting in about 1950, we went straight through the roof. What happened in the 1950s? The Industrial Revolution, right? We figured out how to get oil out and how to burn the heck out of it. Okay? So this is what it looks like. Through forestry and other land use, we're fairly consistent back to the 1800s. It's gone up a little bit because we have increasing populations and we farm more and we run more livestock. But the fossil fuels, cement, I'm going to have to get into cement manufacturing because I don't know why it's such a big emitter of methane and atmospheric gases, but apparently it is. But flaring, y'all flare any gas up here in the Panhandle? See, in some areas they collect it all, some areas they can't afford to, and they flare a lot of it. Well, that's all contributing to greenhouse gases. But the biggest thing is in the 50s, we really started burning a lot of fossil fuels. So if we're placing all of the emphasis on managing greenhouse gases from livestock, how big an impact are we going to have on increasing carbon dioxide levels? Little to none. If we cut it in half, we wouldn't have a major impact. And so the focus is not just on cattle for environmental impacts. There's underlying issues associated with that, with diet and health and things that other people perceive as a problem with beef. But if you look at energy consumption in the U.S., petroleum's way up there, natural gas, coal, biomass. What's biomass? That's that lady out on the plains picking up buffalo chips and burning them. Honestly, it's plant material you burn is biomass. We have a whole research division at A&M looking at building biomass that we can burn and generate power with. Y'all, how many of you have a pellet cooker? Do y'all know there's some states that are trying to ban pellet cookers? What are our options? And they're banning outside grilling. That's proposed because we're trying to get away from releasing greenhouse gases from biomass. See what a small percentage that is. We wouldn't make a bit of difference by cutting all the pellet grills in the world out. So when we really look at U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, livestock and agriculture is in that red bar up there. Not a whole lot of change in that over the years, is there? This goes back to 1990, so most of the increase in use has been in energy, and that's actually dropped off a little bit, so we're actually making some progress there. The green line at the bottom is how much is removed out of the atmosphere through land sequestration. So if you look at agriculture, all of it could be stuck in the land use, and we'd have no net accumulation of greenhouse gases. But when we add all this other stuff on top of it, it gets confusing, let's put it that way. But if we're going to attack something and carbon dioxide is a culprit, then we really have to get after the big chunk in the middle. That's all. I don't know how any other way you can say it. That's where you're going to make a difference. So once again, you got to decide whether or not that's a real problem, whether we're actually changing environments. But we've never in history had this much CO2 in the atmosphere, and that's what everybody's worried about. Now, for anything we release, it has to go somewhere, okay? So they call them sinks. The ocean takes up a lot of CO2, but then that also creates issues in the ocean, okay? And the heating and cooling of oceans affects our weather patterns. What was the first thing we talked about? Weather, the cool ocean currents. Maybe we need to turn that cooker up and toast the Pacific for a little while to get some moisture out of it. But that's not how that works either, because those currents mix those around. Land sink is another one where it's in forest primarily and also in grasslands, but the rest of it accumulates in the atmosphere. It's all going somewhere. So we've actually improved our land sink a little bit and have more carbon sequestration there than we do or have in the past. So just think about that. There is a limit to how much can be put in these other sinks so it accumulates in the atmosphere. Now here's the U.S. enteric methane emissions from beef cattle. Over time, we've not gone up and we've gone down slightly. This is that whole efficiency and sustainability thing we talk about. Other industrialized nations have improved as well. And in this UN report, it actually talks about the intensification of beef cattle production being a way to limit greenhouse gas emissions. What do we have in the U.S.? A fairly intensive beef production system, although the beef cows are out on range and most of the stocker cattle have a pasture phase to it as well. So we can change that, and we have by the way we manage cattle in the United States. Developing nations are having increasing livestock numbers without intensification. So we actually see more desertification, degradation of rangelands or pasture lands, and so that's part of the issue we have to deal with. But we get lumped in with the red line in these statements that we see. Now this is also looking at the efficiency of carcass weight and emissions. We produce significantly less on a per pound of carcass weight than any other place in the world. I'll skip through that. This is the carbon cycle I talk about. So if the cow doesn't eat grass, we can sequester carbon in the soil for a while. What happens if we don't consume that plant or have that cycle. That plant can die, right? If it's not managed right and doesn't have a growth cycle, it can die. So our job is to either let it happen, or some termites, anything else can eat grass. Y'all know termites are one of the largest methane emitters in the world? We never talk about termites. Where do we find more termites than anywhere else? Forest. Okay, I'm gonna get to that in a minute. So there's a whole bunch of things we don't know about this, and we're trying to blame one specific part of it. But ruminants are a major player in life cycle. Now, it doesn't show what we do with the meat. It's part of the cycle as well. We consume that. We go back into the system, but cattle are a huge part of this. And so we have to, and it could be other ruminants, but something that can digest forages, and bacteria digest forages. We blame the cow for methane production. Does the cow produce methane? The cow does not produce any methane. The bacteria in her rumen produce methane. The cow's getting blamed for what's happening inside her, but if we alter the methane production, we change the bacterial populations in the rumen, FDA then comes in and says, well, that's an antibiotic. You're using antibiotics in beef cattle production, and they're regulated. There's a lot of ways we can cut methane come nearly completely out of a cow's emissions, but it gets very difficult to do. But anyway, this is a good talking point. These graphics are available on the internet, but we are a big part of that cycle. Whether we eat them or they die and they go back in the earth, we're just a cycle. I thought this was interesting. They found methane-eating bacteria living in trees. Now, if the methane-eating bacteria is living in a tree, that means what? The tree's emitting methane. That's the food source for the bacteria. This was first reported in 1907 that trees emit methane. We've all been told all this time that trees just absorb carbon dioxide and it's a big sink and it gets greenhouse gases out of the environment. But it also is one of the largest emitters of methane in the rainforest, or the trees. You got to know the whole story. We get cherry picking stuff sometimes and it gets to be a problem. This is very interesting to me that the trees account for a large portion of methane production in the environment. Never been, and that only came out last week actually, that I saw this in the press. And you hear this all, trees are the earth's lungs. Well, everything that's photosynthesis is a lung of the earth. It's not just trees. It's just that they have a bigger leaf structure and can do that. So if trees are emitting methane, are they warming their own planet? It's an interesting little phenomenon. We go round and round. If you look at beef cattle emissions in the context of all global emissions, we have a 0.47% contribution to global greenhouse gases. So if we're going to attack meat consumption and beef production in the United States, how big an impact are we going to have on a global basis? And I was sitting back there, the first thing I pulled up on social media was this morning. So I had to add it to the presentation. It's not in your packet, by the way. But I just want to sit around and scream that all the time. You cannot blame cattle for global warming. It makes no sense to do that. Do we contribute to greenhouse gases? Yeah. It's part of that cycle. We also take them out through our plant management. So we are a key player in this deal, but we are not causing climate change. Now, I can harp on and on about this, and I better quit. But different ruminants have different methane emissions. And I don't know how many people want to go back to bison. And there may be some bison, but nothing wrong with that. But guess what? They can contribute more greenhouse gases per pound of protein created than anything because they're less efficient than cattle. That's why we run cattle instead of bison. They're more efficient at converting all this. So once again, all of this is out there. It's just according to how people want to use it. and what their belief system is in making these changes. Now, this is a busy slide, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through it, but that, I don't know, some of the ladies, what color is that pinkish orange looking bar? What is that? Because if I say it, it's going to be wrong. I know that. Coral. We'll go with coral. All right. Coral is the cow-calf sector. I couldn't argue with it if I wanted to. Close enough. All right, so most of the methane comes out of the cow-calf sector. Why? Forage-based, part of the system. Okay? Feeding and stocker, very little methane comes out of that because of the way we manage and feed them and control the diet. So if we went back to a grass-based economy, would we make progress or lose in this scenario? We'd lose ground, right? We go back to more greenhouse gases. So when you look at this, the cow-calf sector is the biggest contributor to nearly all of those areas. And so we as cow-calf producers have a responsibility to manage those the best we can. We're not going to eliminate methane and don't need to, but we need to have a way for it to get back into the system, create grass for the carbon cycle to be more efficient. All right, I'm going to quit pretty quick. Probably, I had an alarm set. Am I over my time yet or not? This is looking at global emissions. It is increasing. Remember I showed that graph, everything's going up. Who are the biggest emitters? China is by far the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. That's why our former administration pulled out of that global effort to curb greenhouse gases because we were going to pay the biggest tax, but we weren't the biggest emitter. Now we are second, but we're actually declining. European Union is declining. India is increasing. As industrialization occurs there, and they also have more livestock and more cattle. The largest cattle population in the world is in India. They don't eat them for the most part. Now, they got a lot of water buffalo, they do, and that's considered beef. They are also the largest beef producer in the world. But it's not their cows, it's their water buffalo. All right, so that's just keep things in perspective and how we fit into the percentages. But we have all these sinks we talked about earlier and sources of pollution. Deforestation, industrialization is certainly the two biggest. And we can only put so much in the atmosphere without it causing some change, probably. Forest can absorb a lot of it. And the oceans. I didn't realize the oceans were such a big sink for carbon dioxide as they are until I started going through this as well. But we have to manage all those to make sure that we have a place for it to go. Forest is, we keep talking about forest, and this is one of those deals why. Forest is the largest sink for CO2 in the world. And this is the U.S. We have much more sink in the U.S. than we have production. So when you look at it on a land basis, animal use, land use scenario, we're much better off here than we are in a lot of parts of the state. I am a very poor substitute for a good presentation on this, okay? Dr. Frank Mitliner, he even goes by the handle of Greenhouse Guru on Twitter. He's not on Facebook, so you'd have to follow him on Twitter. But if you're interested in this, I would encourage you to do that because he puts out a lot of stuff. We have a little bit of information. I put a publication in y'all's packet as well. But he also runs the Clear Center at UC Davis. We had him at Beef Cattle Short Course 2 or 3 years ago. One of the best presentations I've ever seen on this, if you can understand his German accent. He can talk 100 miles an hour, and he's real passionate about this. But he is the one that is affecting more change in policy on the positive side for the agriculture industry than anybody else in the world right now. He's the one that got a hold of AOC and got her to back off a little bit. Y'all notice she didn't have anything really to say until Trump was out of office. And now that's kind of coming back up. But he actually contacted her and said, we need to have a conversation about the Green New Deal. And so he actually changed her mind a little bit. If you ever listen to her now, she actually has a little understanding of what happens in the beef cattle sector. Pretty scary, but it's there. But this is the website. That's actually his Twitter page. And then it's Clear Center, clear at ucdavis.edu. That is his mission. is to work on education in this. He does a great job. We're catch up. There's a lot of places trying to do work in sustainability in this area. I'll try to answer questions if you have any. Like I said, I'm not the best in the world on this. It just drives me crazy that we have fallen into this trap when we actually need to be trying to educate people. But we need to know the story before we can educate. Jumping up and down saying, oh, heck, that's not what happens. That's not enough. And we got to quit being emotional about it. But realize we all have a stake in this, right? And so as we do go through that, we need to make sure that we're accurate in what we do. Does anybody have a quick question for me? Yes, sir. I don't even know. There's glacier fields. Yeah. Sunspots. I mean, most of the warming, he has a great question. Why glaciers receded years ago, why we don't have, if everything stayed static, those would still be here. We'd still have glaciers in the U.S. and all over. What caused those to recede? What causes the atmosphere to heat up mostly is sunspots. That never gets enough attention. And so when the global warming thing was out there, how many of y'all are old enough to remember when we were going to freeze to death a few years ago? Yep, my God, we had 12 years to live. We survived it, now we got 12 years to live because we're going to get too hot. So, it's a good thing to jump up and down and cause concern about, but there's not a whole lot of basis behind. I think the biggest concern, we've never seen CO2 levels this high in the oceans or the atmosphere, so what's going to happen? We don't know. How do we know? We're making assumptions. Oh, yeah, we do know. Because of carbon dating, you can tell. Well, we can be dismissive of technology if we want to, but the fact is there's more CO2 in the atmosphere now by all standards than there ever has been.
Ron, they say the whole panhandle area used to be covered with ocean water.
Yep. Yeah, I grew up just below the cap rock between Snyder and Post, and we got fossils were everywhere. So you knew you were ocean bed. The cap rock's the ocean bed. So things don't stay static, right? I think we're trying to make sure that we don't become the extinct population that lived on Earth one time. It's a noble effort, but I'm not sure we're going to withstand it. I think somebody else may be in control of that. And so if the tectonic plates shift, we'll ride ourselves to South America and the water will wash us off. All right? So we can try to think we're in control. We're not in control. We can mitigate some things, and I think that's where we're at in trying to mitigate our impact in a negative manner. And just realize, if you do what you need to do, you get a reward from better pastures, better cattle, better income. And that goes back to the theme of this. And I apologize for being the downer before the day was over, but we'll go work some cows and see if we can get better.
Can you hang on here just a second? I need you to help me. So, Ron, I want you to look across the crowd and look how many people are still here. They stayed to hear you. This guy's a superstar in the beef cattle business, and he goes literally all over the country. And so, Ron, we've got a couple of books from the breakthrough that we want you to have to take home to share with your family, and we hope that it blesses you. We hope you know that we appreciate you here.
Well, I enjoy this one as much as any I ever do, and thank you very much.
Good. Hang on here now. I need you to help me.